Okay, so what I'm trying to show you guys here, and I went ahead and got a jump start because we've already seen how to do test strips, and we're running out of time here today. So I went ahead and I created a test strip, and I wanted to show you guys the difference in time that it takes when you use the polycontrast filters to add contrast to an image. Now this already had really high contrast, so I'm actually purposely I'm using this because it's an image that you guys have seen me work with, and I have actually an example back behind Floyd if you want to turn around there and grab that for me. So even though this image actually it was very high contrast already, I'm using it as an example for the polycontrast filters, just so you guys can see the difference, see how much the difference the contrast is. It's not exactly the same frame, but it's you know, they were shot within moments of each other. Okay, so mind sending that back. So I'm going to show you the polycontrast filters, and I'm going to kind of talk about how they work and interact with the paper. But I wanted to show you here, I actually did this test strip in 5-second increments. So this is my first one over here, second, third, fourth, and I at least have fifth, sixth, potentially seventh here. So we're talking this over here where we actually have some good dark tones. We're looking at 20 seconds minimum. So what I wanted to show you here is you know, making a contact sheet, a test strip for this, how much even though I'm using the widest aperture on the enlarger, how much the polycontrast filters cut the light hitting the paper, so you really have to extend the amount of time that you're exposing it to light. So I'm gonna guess, I'm gonna say 30, because I'm not even getting really good darks until I'm way over here. So basically I'm creating an image that's gonna be far higher contrast than it needs to be. So how I'm doing that, I just wanted to do that for time, so we gotta come over here now. And I absconded with Floyd's workstation. Okay, so these are the polycontrast filters down in the drawers here, and I'm actually using a 4. There, you can get them much higher, so they're just basically in there in order. Okay, so, but I want to talk about how they actually work, how they interact with the paper. I asked you guys for this class to get this multi-grade paper, and some of you may have noticed that your paper, your prints are not coming out as high a contrast as you might have expected. And I've already talked about this a little bit, but to reiterate, the reason why you might be experiencing that is because the multi-grade paper actually naturally decreases the contrast of your images. So the paper by itself is actually a -2. So it's effectively removing contrast from your images if you're not using polycontrast filters. So I want you guys to start to use the polycontrast filters to control the negative, the contrast in your prints. If you like the lower contrast, that's fine, stick with it. But if you want to ramp up the contrast, then you start introducing these. To negate the effect of the paper, you actually have to put a +2 filter into the enlarger. This actually makes it so that the contrast of the image you shoot would be a 0. So that's the cumulative effect. The paper by itself is a -2. You would put this in, and then basically you would get the contrast that you shot for that particular image. Okay? Now, I'm purposely trying to ramp up, just for example purposes, so you guys can see the difference between the original image I shot, which was already pretty high contrast because I shot it with really hard light. It was midday and the moose was in the shadows. But I'm going to really ramp up the contrast so it's just super apparent. Now let me show you, now we go ahead and someone hit the light please. And you're going to have to get as close as you can without, hopefully, yeah, without, go ahead. Okay, so not there. There we go. Okay, so this is, you know, basically what this looks like before I put the Polycontrast filter in. You can see the image. I've already actually focused, and you should actually focus, use the grain focuser and focus your image without putting the Polycontrast filter in, because once you put the Polycontrast filter in, it's actually going to cut the amount of light down. It's going to be more difficult for you to perceive the details. Okay, same thing for if you are later on, for purposes of dodging and blurring, if you're going to decrease the aperture, obviously you need to focus at 2.8 before you decrease the aperture. Because, you know, and of course, so let me show you what it looks like when I put the Polycontrast in. So it's going to have that, it's cutting the light out, and it's, you know, got a color to it, it's purplish. Okay, so I can't effectively focus the image with this Polycontrast filter in there. So you have to do that without it. And then if I were to cut the aperture down so that I could introduce dodging and burning or whatever, you can see that it's, you know, we don't get much of an image at all. Okay? So we decided on 30 seconds. So I'm going to switch this over. We'll see how we do. I don't know if you can see anything at all. That's okay. Hopefully they just hear us talking. That's the challenge. And I saw some of the prints already. They weren't quite aligned. Make sure you align your paper with all of the little nodes. Okay, and then the terribly exciting 30 seconds. Okay, are we rolling? Okay, yeah, this is high quality production right here. Okay, so again, not necessarily an appropriate image to show you. I mean, because this already had, because of just how hard the light was when I shot this, it already had, you know, great contrast to it. In fact, that's print's too bright. I'm sorry, too dark. But just to show you just how dramatically the contrast filters can affect the paper. I mean, if you look at the, I almost have like a graphic design effect going on.
It's pretty cool on
in the tree. Yeah.
Looking at that.
So, and even actually, yeah, it was an appropriate exposure, but it's crazy to think about. You can actually pop the contrast high enough that, I mean, I have incredibly dark, you know, shadows in here, but then over in here, it's so bright, there's absolutely nothing showing up.
You see that was with the 2?
This was with a +4. So basically I negated the effect of the paper and then went 2 more steps. So that's why there's, when you look in there, there's a half, 1, 1.5, and so on. Because a half step can actually create quite a bit of difference.
Just make it slightly sharper.
Exactly. So when you're looking at something and you're like, I want to increase the contrast, but I don't need to go crazy with it. I just want to pop the contrast just a little bit. You can actually, you know, just increase it by a half step and maybe get the contrast that you want.
If you're working with color photographs, do you use a totally different sort of thing to do that?
A totally different process, different chemistry, everything. Questions?
Mm-hmm.